Did a United States Army Green Beret unit engage an alien race in a firefight in a secret underground base in New Mexico? Over the last few decades, as a researcher and investigator of strange phenomena, I've seen and heard some pretty wild stories. And this next story is one I looked into a few years back. But it's sort of made a comeback on the internet, so I thought we'd give it the extremely strange treatment and kind of sort this whole thing out. It involves cattle mutilations, UFOs, alien abduction, and a secret military underground base. All the sort of things that a researcher of the paranormal lives for. So, grab your tinfoil hats because it's extremely strange. The town of Dulce, New Mexico has a population of less than 3,000 residents and is so small it doesn't even boast a traffic light. Dulce hosts the headquarters of the Sicaraya Apache Reservation of northern New Mexico and is inhabited mainly by indigenous people. So it's somewhat surprising then that Dulce has become a kind of ground zero for ufologists and is said to hold a secret that rivals even the wildest conspiracy theories out there. Our story begins with State Trooper Gabe Valdez, who sometime in 1976 encountered a series of strange cattle mutilations while on patrol, the first being on the Gomez Ranch. In one case, finding one with a dead fetus inside, he said closely resembled a human, monkey, and frog hybrid. Gross. He also claims to have witnessed odd aerial phenomena in the area, what he described as sophisticated spacecraft. Also found at the scene of the cattle mutilations were items like glow sticks for illuminating the area, gas masks, and radar chaff, which is typically released from aircraft to throw off radar detection. This observance was at odds with the FBI's assertion that suggested animal predation rather than human involvement. In fact, scavenging animals would consistently steer clear of the corpses. These incidents drew the attention of the owner of an electronics firm, physicist and acquaintance of Valdez named Paul Benowitz, who claimed he had intercepted radio signals in Dulce originating from an underground source at a frequency at that time too high to be man-made. Benowitz's company held a contract with Kirkland Air Force Base at the time, and he had claimed to see unusual craft over Kirkland and the Manzano weapons storage area. Benowitz also became interested in an abduction case involving a woman and her son, and eventually called University of Wyoming psychology professor Dr. Leo Sprinkle to look into the mother, Myrna Hansen, and her boy, who claimed to have witnessed aliens experimenting on a cow in a nearby field, lifting it toward their craft inside a beam of light. Under regression hypnosis, they recalled being abducted in their car and taken to an underground base where they saw human body parts in vats and were subjected to having implants put into them to monitor their movements before being returned to the vehicle some 6 hours after they had first been abducted. Subsequent CAT scans confirmed that both the mother and son did in fact have foreign objects placed in their bodies. Another attempted abduction was that of Jerry Julian. She and her husband were out stargazing one night when one celestial body in particular began to exhibit signs of movement. The star then suddenly descended from the sky and landed on the ground relatively close to where they were standing. Jerry claimed the light emanating from the object then dissipated to reveal a metallic craft with a set of stairs protruding from it. It was then that two small figures descended the ladder and started toward the couple. Her husband grabbed her, and they both ran toward their truck, which failed to start. Just as the advancing creatures were about to reach the truck, it mercifully did start, and the frightened couple tore off toward home and safety. Or so they thought. Trying to put it behind them for at least the remainder of the night, the couple decided to go to bed. But in the early morning hours, Jerry awoke to what she described as tugging on her bedclothes. Looking toward the bottom of the bed, to her horror, she saw the two alien figures they had seen earlier in the evening. An attempt to scream resulted in only a raspy sound coming from her throat, but it was enough to awaken her husband, and as he turned over toward her, the two figures disappeared. Eventually, they did report it to authorities, and federal agents paid them a visit. During the interview, Jerry told them that things like this were not uncommon in Dulce, and that most of the locals had spoken of their own strange encounters. Jerry went on to tell them of a hole in the mountain that aliens and their craft would often access. Jerry would go on to tell this story to Ben Hansen on Discovery Channel's UFO Witness. With all this taking place, Benowitz became certain that an underground base did exist, was populated with an alien race, and that part of the operation included the abduction of humans and cattle for surgical experimentation. It was also at this point that Dr. Sprinkle began to notice some aberrant behavior on the part of Benowitz, who at one point was armed and convinced that he was being monitored by aliens at his home and feared the threat of attack. In October of 1980, Benowitz informed the Kirtland Air Base of his investigation, which resulted in the AFOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, sending a man named Richard Doty to visit him at his home. The visit resulted in Benowitz being granted a meeting with various department heads at Kirtland, where he briefed them on his findings and theories. However, rather than dismissing Benowitz as a crank, they encouraged him to continue his studies and report back to them periodically. It's been theorized that they believed that Benowitz had in fact picked up experimental signals being tested and were curious as to how he managed to do it. A more sinister reason for their interest was to simply discredit the obviously disturbed Benowitz by launching a disinformation campaign against him and using him as a patsy to publicly disseminate wild theories, which would also serve to discredit the civilian UFO community in general. But for a moment, let's discuss Richard Doty, who was the subject of an excellent documentary called Mirage Men a few years back. Earlier that year, he met with author and researcher Bill Moore, co-author of The Philadelphia Experiment, who claimed he had received a document which was provided by two contacts from a shadow organization who called themselves the Aviary, known only to Moore as Falcon and Condor, and they detailed a project called Project Silver Sky, which Moore eventually came to understand was nothing but a bunch of bullshit. In his meeting with Doty, Moore blasted him for this intentional deception, to which Doty pointed out was merely a test and that Moore had passed with flying colors. At some point during this meeting, Moore compromised himself by agreeing to pass on false information to his UFO colleagues in exchange for quote-unquote real information from Doty. Moore was then used as a pawn to further discredit and ultimately ruin Benowitz when he was given what was labeled a secret document to show. It mentioned an organization known as Majestic 12 and confirmed something called Project Aquarius, which was actually something previously created in the mind of Benowitz. Now convinced they were taking him seriously, Benowitz went public with the information, which only served the purpose of spreading more disinformation and essentially doing the AFOSI's job for them. Moore, on the other hand, under this duplicitous agreement with Doty, was proving to be a valuable tool as well. The document given to Benowitz established that there was indeed a Project Aquarius and a shadowy organization called Majestic 12 that existed to deal with future alien contact. Project Aquarius claimed, from the military's view, that the Roswell and Aztec crashes were real, and deceased bodies were recovered along with one living one, who shared information with his rescuers/captors. Among the revelations was the existence of 3 alien races who are currently visiting the Earth, with one attempting to assist our species for benevolent reasons, another with a desire to take advantage of our resources, and a third, the Greys, who were responsible for more heinous acts like cattle mutilation and abductions for the purpose of harvesting DNA material. Furthermore, it suggests that our very presence on the planet was the result of just such genetic experiments, and figures like Christ, Muhammad, and even Hitler were employed to manipulate human history under the influence of this alien race. These same manufactured mythologies were also presented to famed UFO researcher and author Linda Moulton Howe by Richard Doty. Moulton Howe had created an Emmy Award-winning documentary in 1980 called Strange Harvest, which detailed the cattle mutilation phenomenon. He had previously encouraged Moore to publish a book containing all the intentional misinformation Moore was sure at that point was legitimate. In 1983, Moulton Howe signed a contract with HBO for a documentary that would feature Paul Benowitz and the Dulce base theory. She had by then had some previous issues with Bill Moore and the group APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, who claimed she sensationalized and embellished the content of Strange Harvest for her own self-promotion, as APRO maintained the whole issue of cattle mutilation was nothing more than a well-orchestrated hoax or a simple misidentification of natural predation. By 1989, Paul Benowitz had suffered a complete mental breakdown and was checked into a mental health facility by his family. He claimed that aliens were coming through the walls to get him and injecting him with chemicals. The years of disinformation, false flags, and psychological manipulation had taken a heavy toll, but not before he published a 1988 paper titled Project Beta, which also detailed a plan to penetrate the base. While working on the HBO project, Richard Doty approached Moulton Howe, expressing a deep interest in her work, and promised to give her secret presidential papers on the subject. It was at this point that Benowitz suffered his breakdown, causing HBO to scuttle the project. And Doty? Well, he pretty much ghosted her from that point on. Years later, when all of this manipulation and double-crossing came to light, both Moore and Doty expressed regret for their roles in it, and APRO, suffering great embarrassment, closed up shop and eventually became MUFON. Now let's discuss the most bizarre claims surrounding the Dulce base, and it centers on a man named Phil Schneider, whose stated experiences there remain shrouded in controversy. In 1979, Schneider claimed to be employed as a geologist at the base and had a remarkable experience there that, if you're not already aware of, might blow your mind. Schneider once revealed that his father, on his deathbed, claimed he was captain of a German U-boat and was captured by Allied forces in 1941, and that he was later part of the Philadelphia experiment, none of which was deemed to be credible. His dad was also said to have taken pictures of aliens on Bikini Island during Operation Crossroads, which involved nuclear testing, and was also purported to have close ties to a Venusian alien named Valiant Thor. It's been said Thor's ship, the Victory 1, is ditched somewhere near Lake Mead in Nevada. Given the increasingly low water table there, if it's still there, we should find it very soon. So stay tuned for that. Philip also claimed that as a young boy, he was given a piece of debris from the Roswell crash, and that he was the only human who could get a captured alien to speak after months of failure to do so by others. Also on this resume was a level 3 clearance with NATO, which made him one of only 3 people to answer directly to the President of the United States. He would eventually meet Al Bielek, a man who also claimed to be part of the Philadelphia experiment and to have participated in mind control and time travel experiments. Upon hearing Schneider's dad was also part of the Philadelphia experiment, Bielek listened to Schneider's incredible Dulce story and urged him to hit the conference circuit to share it with the world. In 1995, Schneider began his lecture tour and told of his role as a geologist in the construction of underground military bases. He claimed there are over 130 such bases in the U.S. alone, with thousands more globally, the oldest of which have been in use since the 1940s. He spoke of a high-speed rail system that connects some of the tunnels, and it was in 1979, while drilling such a tunnel in Dulce, New Mexico, that his crew discovered an unknown cavern that gave off a horrible garbage-like stench. Phil said he was lowered down by a lift into the cavern to investigate it, and when he stepped out, was confronted by a 7-foot-tall gray alien. Phil, who was packing a firearm, panicked and shot the alien and one other, but was quickly surrounded by multiple other similar entities. This would trigger what would become known as the Dulce War of 1979 between the U.S. Army's Delta Force, who were on site, and aliens, in which 66 military personnel and scientists were killed. Schneider claimed to have lost 2 fingers in the firefight, with Delta Force opening up with everything they had, and the aliens countering with bolts of plasma energy that shot from their hands. Now, before totally dismissing this account, as many of you likely will, there are some things to consider, and one is the sudden stoppage of cattle mutilations for a 6-year period immediately following the alleged battle. Another is something he spoke of taking place in 1979 called laser rock deflagration, where lasers are used to create tunnels by pulverizing the rock, leaving a smooth black residue around the outside of the tunnel. There is reasonable doubt that such a technology existed back when he first told his story, but it is today. So was advanced tech being used 20 years before anyone else found out about it? Or was that part just inserted for effect? And now we have to circle back to 1984, when Paul Benowitz was telling the same story based on the experience of a security guard named Thomas Costello, who eventually gave his own first-hand account in 1988. Costello described grotesque experiments being conducted on men, women, and children by aliens, and said he and other personnel were told that the experiments were being conducted on mentally challenged subjects for the greater good of mankind. But other employees told him that the subjects were actually heavily sedated abduction victims. Costello would also leak a photo of an alien-human hybrid kept in a large pouch of an unknown fluid. This photo has pretty much been dismissed as a hoax as well. After this disclosure in 1988, Costello is not heard from again, and there is some lingering doubt that such a person even existed. So perhaps that was another part of the misdirection campaign. If this is not confusing enough, 8 years prior, in 1980, noted ufologist and son of the creator of the Learjet, John Lear, a pilot and former government operative, affirmed he had received 4 different confirmations that the base did in fact exist and consisted of 7 levels. He further claimed it was partially inhabited by various species of aliens who were working in concert with their human counterparts in mutual experimentations on each other's race. This only fueled more speculations about the base's ultimate function. In 2000, Lear claimed that Phil Schneider plagiarized the story he told of Costello's encounter, in which Costello claimed he saw some very unnerving things occurring in his time there, and being told he should not engage with the people working down there as they were not sane individuals. To no one's surprise, Phil Schneider's ex-wife would claim that he was prone to making up extraordinary stories. But when he died under mysterious circumstances, not quite 2 years after he began the lecture circuit, by taking his own life with a catheter cord. She went on to say his death made no sense, even going so far as to dispute whether it was in fact his body that was found. She also approached Gabe Valdez, the state trooper, and asked him to look into it further. And speaking of Gabe Valdez, before his death, he expressed doubt that aliens were involved in all this and that someone, or a mysterious group of people, were responsible for what was going on in Dulce in an effort to make us believe it was an alien race responsible. Now, all this certainly could have been part of Doty and Moore's disinformation campaign, with wild stories being appropriated by anyone trying to take advantage of the mystery surrounding the mountain, borne out by the amazing number of books written on this subject. And with a yearly festival which also bodes well for local businesses, there is enough evidence to suggest there's a certain enthusiasm for perpetuating the legend. But for the people of Dulce, strange lights in the sky and Bigfoot-like creatures wandering in the brush remains a fact of life for them. And those reports predate any of the underground base stories, so putting all those aside, it does seem like Dulce is a hotspot of weirdness. So we'll give Jerry Julian, who started seeing these things back in the 1960s, the final word on this.